Hello, I'm Jessica Carlson. I'm an archivist and a historian, and I've worked here at the National Archives in Kew for over 15 years now. You may have already watched our film on 20th century records, or possibly you've already done some research in that period. Whether your research has taken you back to 1911 or earlier, you'll still be using many of the records that you should already be familiar with. And, as with the sources we've described in that film, most of these records relate to England and Wales. In this film, I'm going to be talking about civil registration records, the census, wills, and parish registers. And finally, I'll give you some pointers for other useful sources for tracing people in this period of the past. Birth, marriage, and death registers from the General Register Office, often called the GRO, go back to 1837. Those aren't our records, but you do need to use them in conjunction with our records to get the best out of them. And we've got research guides that will show you where you can find indexes online and then order copies of any documents you need. TNA doesn't hold the records of civil registration itself, but you can look at the indexes on the website of the GRO or use sites such as www.freebmd.org.uk or commercial providers such as Ancestry or Find My Past. The types of information you will find on each type of certificate varies, but is, broadly speaking, as follows. Birth certificates give the date and place of birth, the details of the mother, including her maiden name if she was married, and usually the father and his occupation. It will also give their address. Please note that, to this day, if the parents of a child are not married to each other, and if the father is then not present at the registration of the birth, he will not be listed on the birth certificate. Marriage certificates will tell you where a marriage took place and which official presided over it. It will also include the details of at least 2 witnesses. It will include the names, addresses, and occupations of the bride and groom, and details of their fathers' names and occupations. You should also be able to tell what, if any, religious persuasion the couple were of. Death certificates will tell you where and when a person died, what caused their death, and how this was certified. It will also record who came to register the death, their relationship, if any, to the deceased person, and whether there was an inquest and potentially a post-mortem into the cause of death. As with so many records, the information supplied in these certificates is only as reliable as the person completing the process. This is an example of a birth certificate for a little girl called Anne Morn. Annie was the youngest of 6 children born to John and Mary Morn in Dewsbury at the tail end of the 19th century. Her birth certificate says that she was born on February 27, 1891, while her baptism certificate, the 1939 register, and her death certificate say she was born on December 27, 1890. Since it seems implausible that a priest could baptise a baby who hadn't been born yet, it would appear that there is something else going on here. My suspicions are further compounded by the registration of Annie's birth under the name Catherine Anne, because Annie's next sister in age was Katie, also known as Kathleen, and her birth is also registered under Catherine some 5 years previously. Sometimes the name is reused for a subsequent sibling after the loss of an infant, but Katie was not only very much alive when her youngest sister was born, but went on to outlive her by some 2 decades. My theory is that having had the baby baptised, an important moment in Catholic family life, Annie's birth went unregistered until she was almost 2 months old. Upon realising that he had in fact forgotten to register her birth, her mother duly attended the register office to do so and gave the incorrect date of birth, moving it from 27th of December to 27th of February. I suspect she may also have had Katie with her, and I wonder if in her desire to give the wrong date with conviction, she became flustered when asked the child's name, and she gave the names for both her daughters present, rather than simply her youngest. Annie is the only child to be registered with 2 names, and all her other siblings use their confirmation names as middle names, as is common in Roman Catholic families, and indeed what Annie did herself once she came to submitting her own entries into state documents. You may have already used the 1911 or the 1921 census, and it's during this period that the census really comes into its own for family history. The National Archives hold the census records for every 10 years from 1841, and the census is very useful because it's one of the few types of records where you can see people in whole family groups and in their context. Now, of course, there are lots of other records in the National Archives and elsewhere that you might use in your family history research, but the census is the one that probably applies to everyone. For example, all adults could vote in the 20th century, or for most of it, so you can trace people through the electoral registers. But once you get back to the Edwardian and Victorian eras, far fewer people could vote, so electoral registers are much less useful. It's really only after 1918 that voting becomes possible for most people in the UK. Census records give so much detail that you can often draft a rough family tree just from the census alone. But of course, you'll need to use other sources to confirm what you've drawn up, or you might find you've jumped to the wrong conclusion. Remember, the census shows you where people were on one night every 10 years, and an awful lot could have happened in between two censuses. It documents one night in a decade, and prior to 1911, that recording is copied over by a stranger who may have taken it upon themselves to amend or correct the entry. The 1851 census is a particularly important census, but it's not the first. There's one earlier than this, 1841, but it contains much less detail than the 1851 onwards. You only get names, approximate ages, and occupation. There's nothing on marital status or on relationships within the household, and the only clue to birthplaces is whether a person was born in the county where they're enumerated, or whether they were born in Scotland, Ireland, or foreign parts. 1851 is the earliest census to show the parish and the county of birth, making it your genealogical springboard to go back a generation. So you can see here a copy of the 1851 census for the Lynch family in Muirfield, Dewsbury, comprising Michael and Maria and their children. 13-year-old Thomas, 11-year-old Catherine, 6-year-old John, 4-year-old Bridget, 2-year-old Henry, and 1-month-old Mary. It looks as though the Lynches moved about a bit before settling in Dewsbury, as Michael, Maria, and their eldest son Thomas were born in Ireland. Catherine was born on board of ship, presumably somewhere in the middle of the Irish Sea. Then John is born in Dewsbury. Bridget is born in Ireland, while Henry and baby Maria were both born in Dewsbury again. I'm always intrigued by babies born at sea, but it's much less common these days. It's worth remembering that the information in the census isn't always accurate. It's only as good as the person who gave the details in the first place, and by the time we get to see it, the information has been copied a couple of times. Indexes and transcriptions are wonderful, but you should always look at the record itself. A transcription is only what someone else thinks it says. I've got an example to show you what I mean. Moving on to the next generation, this is the 1891 census for the Morn family living in Dewsbury in the West Riding. John, aged 38, was a general labourer and was born in Ireland in County Roscommon. His wife Mary was 36 and is the baby of the family we just saw in the 1851 census. You may notice that the dates are out slightly, and this is pretty common in this period of time. John, Mary, and 4 of their children were living together. Maria, aged 13, John, aged 8, Kate, aged 4, and 3-month-old Annie. Mary and all of the children were born in Dewsbury. It's worth noting that this census backs up my hunch about Annie's birth being incorrect on her birth certificate. If she's 3 months old in March, this would suggest that she was born in December rather than February. By the 1901 census, John and Mary are living at 4 Junction Road in Dewsbury with their 2 younger daughters, Kate and Annie, at home with them, alongside their surviving son, John. This census reveals that John Sr. was born in Castlereagh in County Roscommon, and so gives us more detail to pursue his family lines in Ireland. By 1911, we can see that Mary and John had been married for 34 years, and that only 3 of their 6 children were still living. All 3 surviving children are living away from their parents at this point in time. To research before the start of civil registration in 1837, you have to rely on church records, mainly Church of England, C of E, parish registers, which were never collected centrally. They're usually in county record offices or other local archives, so you need to know where to look for them. The parish registers aren't just useful for research before civil registration. They were still kept after 1837, and they're still kept today. These are mostly in county record offices, as I mentioned, but an increasing number of them are now available online, so you can often use them to help with your research long after 1837. Quite a lot of the Roman Catholic records from Liverpool, for example, are available online. Baptism records give less information than birth certificates, usually no mother's maiden name, but they do give addresses and occupations, so they can still help you identify the right entry in the birth indexes. Sometimes, and especially in nonconformist churches, the names of godparents can help confirm that you have the right families. It's pretty common for families to baptise their children together rather than one by one, as in this example, not only do you see the 3 children baptised in the same service, but you also get their dates of birth. Charles and Philadelphia Newman of Cavendish Street in Brighton brought their sons and daughters to be baptised together. Charles was 11, William was 10, and Sarah Selina was 7, and their dates of birth were noted in their line of entry. Marriage records are even better because from 1837, church registers were exactly the same as the ones you get from the General Register Office. In fact, they're actually better because they are the church's registers with original signatures. The ones that were sent to the GRO were just copies. This example is for the marriage of Henry King and Rose Peach, who were married at St Bride's, Fleet Street, in the City of London in 1881. You can see that it not only lists their father's details, but also their occupations and their addresses, plus their witnesses. Earlier entries aren't always as detailed, but useful all the same. This entry from 1799 is pretty typical and shows the recording of the marriage of Samuel Bigg and Mary Bushby at St Leonard, Shoreditch, who were married by banns on September 24th in the presence of Samuel Bigg and George Limming. So you may be able to find your ancestors' marriage entries on one of the big family history sites. You won't always be lucky, but if you can find an ancestor's church marriage entry, it will save you a lot of money on buying marriage certificates. Burial records are usually less helpful than baptisms or marriages because they don't contain as much information, but there is another source that can help you identify a correct death entry in the indexes. There are 2 branches of wills and administrations. Prior to 1858, wills were proved in ecclesiastical courts. Before 1858, wills and administrations were dealt with by a variety of church courts. And because of the way that the Church of England is organised, lots of wills from all over England and Wales, and even beyond, were proved in the top court in the hierarchy, the Archbishop of Canterbury's court. It was known as the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, shortened to PCC. After 1858, wills came under the jurisdiction of the Probate Office, who oversee them to this day. Post-1858 wills can be acquired from the Probate Service, and there is more information about this on our website. You can use the indexes to wills and administrations. The system that's still in force today goes back to 1858, and the earliest of these indexes are actually the most detailed, often giving occupations, addresses, names of executors, or often family members. The wills themselves, some of which you can look at online, are sometimes very brief, but others give a lot of detail about family members. Even if no one in your family ever left a will, and you might be surprised just how many people did, you can still use the details in the indexes to rule out people of the same name who turn out not to be your ancestor. We hold all those pre-1858 records, and they're all online. In fact, they were the first records of the National Archives ever digitised and put online. You don't have to order copies of these wills. You can search them by name and then download and read the whole document on your own device at home. Just to show you an example, this is the will of Harriet Colville, who died in 1847, and her entry is quite typical for this period. Harriet never married and died in Ipswich. Her will notes a request to be buried as close to her parents and late brother as possible, and asked her nephew, the Reverend William Colville, to undertake a funeral, intending it to be as plain and as little expensive as possible. She went on to leave requests to her nephew, and specifically to her nephew's wife Elizabeth. Probate was granted in 1847. These are just the main sources that everyone might expect to use, but of course there are lots of records in the National Archives and in other record offices that will be very useful for at least some people. If your ancestors didn't belong to the Church of England, we have a big collection of nonconformist records. We also have some records of births, marriages and deaths overseas. Some are in our Foreign Office collections, while others relate to the armed forces. Nonconformist records are normally held at local, county and city archives, as are most Church of England records. Increasingly, such records are being made available online, as are some of the bishop's transcripts. Some of these have been indexed and digitised, but many others haven't, although work is ongoing on this. From 1858 onwards, marriages in England and Wales could be dissolved by divorce, and we hold most of those records up to the 1930s. And for those up to around the First World War, these are also digitised and indexed online. These are in the J77 series and can be viewed here at Kew. There is a series of similar records for the post-1917 divorces for reference. You might also find records about your ancestors' education or perhaps their occupations either at the National Archives or in local archives. You may also find a lot of things in published sources, especially if your ancestor worked in certain professions. Kelly's directories, or a local equivalent, can be a great source of information about the lives our ancestors led. If your ancestors moved around the world, we have some passenger lists from 1890 onwards, and if your ancestor became a naturalised British subject at any time, we should have a record of that too. Prior to 1844, if someone wished to naturalise, this required an Act of Parliament. The London Gazette includes notices of this, and you can search their records for more details. After 1844, naturalisation was overseen by the Home Office, and you may find some useful information there if this applies to your ancestors. We also have some records of arrivals, like this certificate of arrival from the Port of London in 1852 for an Austrian merchant called Aristide Chico, who arrived by boat from Ostend on September 11th. We also have some records for railway companies, for example, and you can read the particulars of an individual's time working on the railways. Some of these are available online. Nearly every family has members who served in the armed forces in the 2 world wars because of conscription, but before 1911 this was not the case. The military service records across the 19th century are open, and details of service in the Army and the Royal and Merchant Navies. Military and naval records are still amongst our most popular records of family historians, so keep an eye out for future films exploring both of those sources. One of the advantages of researching records before 1911 is that, unlike later records, they're not going to be closed for privacy reasons. So while we can't look forward to more records being released, we can look forward to a lot of existing records being indexed or, better still, digitised. This is particularly true of records such as parish registers and local school and employment records, in addition to some court material. If you're looking for someone who was tried in the Old Bailey in London, for example, a huge number of their historic cases, including the 19th century, are available on their website. Some top tips, regardless of the period you are searching in. Remember that we have research guides to give you much more detail on the records than I've had time to give you here, and there are also lots of films, webinars and blog posts on our website too that will help you. Remember that the information in the census, or indeed any other comparable record, is only as good as the person providing it, and it won't always be accurate, as we've seen. So be flexible with your search terms. Don't just look at the individual household where your ancestor was, look at their neighbours, look at their surroundings. This can tell you an awful lot more about the life they could have led. And finally, best of luck with your research.